For over a century and a half, when a general in Berlin, a shipping magnate in Buenos Aires, or a deposed monarch with 3 days left on the throne needed somewhere to put money where no government could touch it, they arrived at the same small Alpine country, wedged between France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. Switzerland spent that entire period marketing itself as the most trustworthy place on earth to hold money, neutral in every war, stable through every currency collapse, discreet by law. The postcard version says the Swiss built their banking system on watchmakers' precision and Calvinist thrift, that the numbered account was simply what a small, prudent country produced, while the rest of Europe burned. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the postcard leaves out is who was actually depositing the money, and why a law passed in 1934 to protect one very specific set of clients ended up sheltering almost everyone else who needed to disappear. The record kept by the banks themselves, once regulators finally forced it into daylight decades later, tells a considerably less flattering story than the one printed in the tourism brochures, and it runs through a single piece of legislation, a handful of named institutions, and at least 2 men who went to prison for telling outsiders what their employers actually did. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Swiss banking secrecy did not begin as a grand constitutional principle. It began as a set of informal customs among private bankers in Geneva and Basel, most of them Protestant merchant families who had been managing money quietly since the 16th century, when Huguenot refugees fleeing Catholic France brought both capital and a well-founded distrust of state authority with them. Credit Suisse traces back to a railway financier named Alfred Escher, who founded it in 1856 to fund Swiss industrial expansion. Union Bank of Switzerland and Swiss Bank Corporation, the 2 institutions that would eventually merge into UBS, traced to 1862 and 1854 respectively. None of these houses were built as vaults for foreign secrets. They became that almost by accident, and then by law, in response to a scandal that had nothing to do with the reason usually given for Swiss secrecy today. In 1932, French police raided the Paris branch of the Basler Handelsbank and walked out with a client ledger. What they found inside embarrassed half the French establishment. Bishops, generals, industrialists, and sitting members of parliament, all holding undeclared accounts in Basel to avoid French taxes. The scandal became a public sensation, and it put the Swiss banking industry on notice that its client lists were not as safe as advertised. 2 years later, as the Nazi government in Berlin began ordering German citizens, particularly German Jews, to register and repatriate any foreign-held assets under threat of imprisonment or worse, the Swiss parliament passed the Federal Act on Banks and Savings Banks. Article 47 of that act made it a criminal offense, punishable by fine and imprisonment, for any bank employee to disclose client information to anyone, including a foreign government, without the client's consent. The Swiss Bankers Association, an industry body formed in 1912 specifically to coordinate the private bank's interests before Parliament, lobbied hard for the strictest possible version of the statute, and its members knew perfectly well that the same wall keeping the Gestapo out would keep every other government's tax office out as well. The law was publicly justified as protection for German account holders facing Nazi confiscation orders, and there is genuine truth in that justification. But the timing tells a second story that ran alongside the first one. The same secrecy statute that shielded a Jewish industrialist's savings from Gestapo inquiry also shielded the French bishop's undeclared account from a magistrate in Paris, and Swiss banks had every commercial incentive to make sure both kinds of client kept banking in Zurich. Article 47 itself carried real teeth from the start. A violation was punishable by up to 6 months in prison and a fine, and lawmakers strengthened the penalty considerably in a later revision, raising the maximum prison term to 5 years for cases involving deliberate disclosure carried out for profit. The law's persistence through nearly a century of political pressure was matched by a slower shift in how Switzerland regulated its own banks internally. The oversight body that existed in 1934 had limited independent authority to inspect bank conduct at all, and it took until 2007 for Switzerland to consolidate banking, insurance, and securities oversight into a single independent regulator, the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, created largely in response to the reputational damage the Bergier Commission's findings had already done to the country's international standing, and a tacit admission that self-regulation by an industry this large could no longer be left entirely to the industry itself. The numbered account, where a client's name was replaced inside the bank's own internal records by a code known only to a handful of senior officers, existed informally before 1934. After the law passed, it became the product the entire Swiss financial sector sold to the world, your money, entirely legal or not, protected by criminal statute from any outside eye. The mechanics behind that promise were less exotic than the mythology suggested. A client's name still existed somewhere inside the bank, usually known to no more than 2 or 3 senior officers, and recorded in a locked file kept separate from the daily transaction ledger. Every teller who processed a wire, every clerk who printed a statement, saw only a code, a string of digits standing in for a person the institution had promised never to identify. It was closer to a filing system than a fortress, and it worked exactly as well as the discipline of the handful of people who held the key. By the mid-1950s, the system's reputation had already produced its own vocabulary. In November of 1956, during a sterling crisis triggered partly by the Suez conflict, British officials began referring publicly to Swiss currency traders as the gnomes of Zurich, a phrase that stuck for decades and captured, not entirely unfairly, how much of the world's financial anxiety by then ran through a country of fewer than 5 million people. By the time the Volcker Committee finished its work at the end of the 1990s, independent industry estimates put roughly 1/3 of all privately held offshore wealth on Earth inside Swiss institutions, a share so large that no single American regulator, French tax office, or Italian magistrate could plausibly claim to know what it actually contained. The stability of the Swiss franc that clients paid so much to access was a genuinely separate achievement from the secrecy law and worth distinguishing from it. Switzerland kept a formal gold backing requirement written into its own constitution long after other major economies had abandoned the practice, and did not remove that requirement until a nationwide referendum in 1999, making it the last country in the world to sever a modern currency's direct constitutional link to gold. That monetary conservatism gave depositors a genuine reason to trust the franc, independent of anything the secrecy law provided. The two reputations, one built on sound money and one built on silence, arrived in the same country at roughly the same moment in history, and Swiss banks spent the following decades selling both as though they were a single product. The industry built to sell that product was, by any ordinary economic measure, disproportionate to the country hosting it. Switzerland licensed several hundred banks at once through much of the 20th century, an unusually dense concentration of a single financial sector for a nation of its population, and by the 1980s the private banking industry alone accounted for a share of Swiss economic output that few other countries came close to matching from any single sector. A small Alpine economy had, in effect, built its national income substantially around the business of keeping other countries' money out of sight. World War II turned that promise into something considerably darker than tax avoidance. The Swiss National Bank, founded in 1907 and led through the war years by Chairman Ernst Weber, continued doing business with Nazi Germany's Reichsbank throughout the conflict, purchasing gold at a pace that made Switzerland one of the Reichsbank's largest wartime counterparties. Decades later, the Independent Commission of Experts Switzerland, a historical commission established by the Swiss government in 1996 and chaired by historian Jean-François Bergier, examined the wartime ledgers directly and found that the Swiss National Bank had purchased gold from the Reichsbank worth roughly 1.5 billion Swiss francs across the war years. A portion of that gold, the commission concluded, had been looted from the central bank reserves of occupied countries including Belgium and the Netherlands. Another portion, smaller but far more disturbing, traced back to the personal possessions of concentration camp victims, wedding rings, eyeglass frames, and dental fillings, melted down by the SS Economic Office and shipped west under the codename Melmer, after the SS officer who organized the deliveries. The Bergier Commission could not determine with precision how much of that specific gold entered Swiss vaults, because the wartime documentation itself had gaps, some of them the product of deliberate destruction. Where the paper trail breaks, the Commission said so directly, rather than filling the silence with certainty it did not have. Switzerland was not the only neutral country buying gold from the Reichsbank. Portugal and Spain both did the same throughout the war. But Switzerland handled by far the largest share, and it kept buying even after January of 1943, when the Allied governments issued a joint warning, later known as the Gold Declaration, stating they would not recognize any transfer of gold looted from occupied central banks and would hold recipient institutions accountable once the war ended. According to the Bergier Commission's later account, the Swiss National Bank's leadership read that warning and concluded that the commercial cost of turning away a customer who still, as of early 1943, looked capable of winning the war, outweighed the practical risk of the threat itself. Once the bullion arrived, private Swiss refineries melted much of it down and recast it into standard Swiss bars stamped with domestic markings, a routine industrial process that had the incidental effect of erasing whatever the original ingot might have revealed about where the metal had come from. Even before the war ended, American and British intelligence services had begun tracking exactly this kind of transaction under a joint program known as Safe Haven, launched in 1944 specifically to trace German assets flowing into neutral countries and to prevent Nazi officials from using Swiss accounts to fund a post-war resurgence. Safe Haven investigators compiled detailed reports on Swiss bank activity throughout 1945, but the program's findings carried little practical weight once the war ended and the Allied governments turned their attention to rebuilding Europe rather than pursuing neutral banks for wartime conduct. After the war ended, the Allied powers pressed Switzerland to account for what it had bought. The result was the Washington Agreement of 1946, under which Switzerland agreed to pay 250 million Swiss francs toward Allied reconstruction and to release Swiss assets that had been frozen in the United States during the war, in exchange for the Allies dropping further claims on the gold question. It was, by any measure, a fraction of the gold's actual value, and it closed the matter officially for nearly 50 years. Switzerland's wartime banking conduct did not resurface as a live political issue again until the mid-1990s, and when it did, gold was only half the story. The other half involved people who were never soldiers or governments at all, only ordinary depositors who trusted the same vault that was quietly filling with looted metal. Before and during the war, thousands of Jewish families across Germany, Austria, and occupied Europe had moved savings into Swiss accounts specifically because Swiss law promised silence. Many of those depositors were murdered in the camps before the war ended. Their heirs, when they tried to claim the money afterward, ran into a bureaucratic wall built from the same secrecy the depositors had originally sought. Swiss banks generally required a death certificate to release funds to an heir, and death certificates were not something the Nazi camp system issued. Families without exact account numbers, without paperwork that had been destroyed alongside the people who once held it, were frequently turned away outright. The money simply sat, earning the bank's interest, officially dormant, for half a century. Internal correspondence uncovered decades later by the Volcker Committee's auditors showed bank officers instructing colleagues to write back to inquiring heirs that no such account could be located. In cases the same auditors subsequently confirmed were sitting on the bank's own books the entire time, still accruing interest under the name of a depositor who had died in a camp the bank's own file already listed by name. The dormant account issue did not become public pressure until 1995, when the World Jewish Congress, led by Edgar Bronfman, began pushing Swiss banks for an accounting. New York City and state officials, with real leverage over any bank that wanted to operate in the American financial system, threatened sanctions against Swiss institutions doing business on American soil. Facing the possibility of losing access to the largest banking market on earth, the Swiss banking establishment agreed to an independent audit. Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the United States Federal Reserve, was brought in to lead what became known as the Volcker Committee, formerly the Independent Committee of Eminent Persons, which spent roughly 3 years, from 1996 to 1999, combing through Swiss bank records for accounts that matched Holocaust victims. In August of 1998, UBS and Credit Suisse agreed to a settlement of $1.25 billion with survivors and heirs, brought as a class action in United States federal court and overseen by Judge Edward Corman in Brooklyn. It was the first time in the history of the 1934 secrecy law that Swiss banks opened their vault, under outside legal pressure, to prove what was actually inside it. Judge Corman later divided the settlement fund into several separate classes, one for depositors whose accounts had genuinely gone unclaimed, one for slave and forced laborers who had worked for Swiss-linked industrial firms during the war, one for refugees turned away at the Swiss border between 1938 and 1945, and one for the looted asset class tied directly to the Bergier Commission's gold findings. Distributing the money took years longer than negotiating it, since verifying a claim against a bank that had spent 50 years insisting the account did not exist required exactly the kind of documentation the war itself had destroyed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the time the Volcker Committee finished its audit, Switzerland's vault had already spent decades hosting a second category of client that had nothing to do with the war. When a dictator lost his grip on power, his personal fortune, drawn from decades of siphoned foreign aid, extracted resource royalties, and outright treasury theft, tended to end up in the same numbered accounts, built to protect discretion. Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines fled Manila in February of 1986, with an estimated several billion dollars in assets scattered across accounts worldwide, a significant share of it in Switzerland. Swiss authorities froze the accounts almost immediately, a rare and genuinely cooperative move by Swiss standards, but the actual return of the money took 17 years of litigation through both Swiss and Philippine courts before roughly $600 million was finally transferred to the Philippine government in 2003. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, who ruled for over 3 decades while his country's mineral wealth financed a personal fortune estimated at several billion dollars at its peak, saw his Swiss accounts frozen only after his fall from power in 1997. By the time Swiss and Congolese authorities finished the legal process 12 years later, in 2009, the amount actually recovered and returned came to just under $7 million, a figure so small, relative to the fortune once rumored, that it told its own story about how much had already moved elsewhere by the time anyone came looking. The Duvalier family of Haiti produced a similar pattern, assets frozen after the 1986 fall of Jean-Claude Duvalier, litigated for decades, and eventually released in amounts far smaller than the fortune investigators believed had once moved through Swiss accounts. General Sani Abacha of Nigeria, who died in office in 1998 after 5 years of rule, financed substantially by looted central bank funds, produced one of the larger recoveries on record. Swiss authorities froze roughly $700 million tied to the Abacha family across the years that followed, and by 2005 had returned most of it to the Nigerian government, a settlement made possible mainly because Nigerian investigators, unlike their counterparts pursuing Mobutu's fortune, were able to trace specific transfers back to identifiable central bank withdrawals rather than relying on rumor and estimate. The difference between the two outcomes, one recovering nearly everything and the other recovering almost nothing, had less to do with Swiss cooperation than with the quality of the paper trail each government's own investigators were able to assemble before they ever picked up the phone to burn. What made these cases possible at all was a legal mechanism separate from the secrecy law itself, one built specifically to handle dictators rather than tax evaders. Switzerland's federal authorities could freeze assets tied to what they classified as politically exposed persons, and did so with increasing speed as the pattern repeated across the 1980s and 90s. But the freeze was never the same as disclosure. Ordinary account holders, the private clients whose money was simply undeclared rather than stolen from a national treasury, remained protected by Article 47 exactly as the law had promised in 1934, and for most of the 20th century, that protection held regardless of who was asking or why. It held, that is, until an American private banker working out of UBS's Geneva office decided to tell the United States government exactly how the system worked from the inside. Bradley Birkenfeld had spent years managing Swiss private banking relationships for wealthy American clients, and in June of 2007, he approached the United States Department of Justice with a detailed account of how UBS systematically helped Americans hide assets from the Internal Revenue Service. His disclosures described bankers traveling into the United States on tourist visas, carrying encrypted laptops to service undeclared accounts, in direct violation of American banking law, meeting clients at art shows and yacht regattas rather than bank branches, to avoid leaving a paper trail, coaching them on how to structure shell entities in places like Liechtenstein and the British Virgin Islands to further obscure ownership, and in at least one case, helping a client smuggle diamonds into the country inside a tube of toothpaste rather than declare them at customs. The investigation that followed produced a deferred prosecution agreement in February of 2009, under which UBS paid a fine of $780 million, and, in a move that would have been unthinkable under Article 47 a decade earlier, agreed to turn over the names of roughly 4,500 American account holders directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Birkenfeld himself was prosecuted for his own role in the scheme he had exposed and served roughly 2.5 years in federal prison. He emerged in 2012 to receive a whistleblower award of $104 million from the IRS, the largest such award in American history at the time, a payout that made explicit exactly how much the government believed his information had been worth. The exposure of the UBS scheme also gave the Internal Revenue Service leverage to launch an offshore voluntary disclosure program the same year, offering Americans with undeclared foreign accounts a chance to come forward, pay back taxes and a reduced penalty, and avoid criminal prosecution. More than 50,000 taxpayers eventually used the program over the years it remained open, a number regulators later pointed to as rough evidence of how widespread the practice Birkenfeld had described inside a single bank actually was, across the broader Swiss private banking industry. Birkenfeld was not the only insider punished for cracking the vault open. A former bank Julius Baer employee named Rudolf Elmer, who had worked in the bank's Cayman Islands operation before returning to Switzerland, began handing over client data in the mid-2000s to expose what he described as systematic offshore tax structuring for wealthy clients. In January of 2011, he appeared publicly alongside WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in London to hand over compact discs of client records. Swiss prosecutors charged him under the same banking secrecy statute that had governed the industry since 1934, and he spent time in solitary confinement while the case worked through the Swiss court system across nearly a decade. It was not until 2016 that Switzerland's Federal Supreme Court cleared him of the most serious charges, leaving only a minor conviction related to a threatening communication sent during the ordeal. Elmer's case and Birkenfeld's case ran on almost identical timelines through almost identical mechanisms. Two men inside the system, punished by the very law they had broken to expose what the law had been protecting. UBS was the largest Swiss institution caught in the investigation that followed Birkenfeld's disclosures, but it was not the last. In February of 2012, the United States Department of Justice indicted Voegelen & Company, a private bank founded in 1841 that predated the Swiss federal secrecy law by nearly a century, making it the first foreign bank ever criminally charged under American law for conspiring to help clients evade taxes. Voegelen pleaded guilty in January of 2013 to helping American clients hide more than $1.2 billion from the Internal Revenue Service over roughly a decade, paid around $74 million in restitution and fines, and closed permanently, rather than continue operating under the weight of a criminal conviction, ending an institution older than the American federal income tax itself. Credit Suisse itself pleaded guilty to a similar conspiracy charge in 2014, becoming the largest bank in decades to enter a criminal guilty plea in the United States, and paid a fine of $2.6 billion, the largest penalty imposed in this entire category of case. Rather than wait to be indicted bank by bank, Swiss authorities and the American government negotiated a broader resolution known afterward as the Swiss Bank Program, under which more than 80 additional Swiss banks came forward between 2013 and 2015, disclosed their own cross-border business with American clients, and paid a combined total exceeding $1.3 billion in penalties in exchange for formal assurances they would not be prosecuted. What had begun as a single, centuries-old promise of silence, codified in one statute in 1934, ended not in a single dramatic repeal, but in dozens of separate settlements, each institution negotiating its own price for the same admission UBS had already made years earlier. German tax authorities pursued a considerably blunter version of the same strategy during those same years. Beginning around 2008, several German state finance ministries began purchasing stolen client data directly from disgruntled Swiss bank employees, paying informants sums that in some cases reached several million euros for a single compact disc of account records. Swiss officials denounced the practice as a form of state-sponsored data theft and threatened prosecution of any German official who traveled to Switzerland in connection with it. But German authorities kept buying, and each purchase was followed by a fresh wave of voluntary disclosures from German citizens who preferred to come forward on their own terms rather than risk their name appearing on a disc a state government had already paid for. The pressure that Birkenfeld's disclosures set in motion did not stay contained to UBS. In 2010, the United States Congress passed the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, a law with a blunt enforcement design. Any foreign financial institution, anywhere in the world, that failed to report its American account holders directly to the Internal Revenue Service would face a 30% withholding penalty on nearly all of its United States source income. For a Swiss banking sector with deep exposure to American markets, that penalty was not a manageable cost of doing business. It was existential. Swiss institutions began signing compliance agreements within a few years of the law's implementation in 2014, reporting American client information as a matter of routine rather than as the product of a decade-long federal investigation. The law itself ran to nearly 400 pages of regulatory text once the Treasury Department finished writing the implementing rules, and compliance departments across the Swiss banking sector grew accordingly, hiring specialists whose entire job consisted of determining whether a given account holder counted as a United States person under a definition broad enough to capture dual citizens who had not set foot in America in decades. What FATCA did for American account holders specifically, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Common Reporting Standard did for nearly everyone else. Switzerland signed on to the Automatic Exchange of Information Framework in 2014 and began the actual exchange of account data with dozens of partner countries starting in 2018, transmitting balances, interest income, and account holder identities to foreign tax authorities as a matter of standing bilateral agreement rather than case-by-case legal battle. A leak of internal documents from a Panamanian law firm in 2016, which came to be known as the Panama Papers, and a similar leak from a Bermuda-based firm in 2017 known as the Paradise Papers, reinforced the same message from outside the formal treaty system entirely, showing journalists and tax authorities across dozens of countries how offshore structures actually functioned, even in jurisdictions that had signed nothing. More than 100 jurisdictions had signed on to the automatic exchange standard within a few years of Switzerland's own participation, turning what had once been a bilateral negotiation between Bern and Washington into a default global expectation that any bank operating across borders would report what it held. For the first time since 1934, a foreign account holder, whose home country participated in the exchange, could no longer assume that Article 47 would protect them from their own government. The law itself was never repealed. It remains on the books, and Swiss citizens still enjoy meaningful protection from having their own domestic banking details exposed to Swiss authorities or the Swiss press without cause. What changed was the international wall, the one built specifically to keep foreign governments out, and that wall came down not through legislative reform, but through a combination of whistleblower testimony, American regulatory leverage, and an international reporting standard that made unilateral secrecy too expensive for even Switzerland's largest institutions to keep maintaining. The reputation for permanence took a second, unrelated hit in March of 2023, when Credit Suisse, the country's second-largest bank and one of the two institutions that had signed the 1998 Holocaust settlement, collapsed under a wave of client withdrawals and years of accumulated scandal. Swiss authorities invoked emergency legislative powers over a single weekend to force a takeover by UBS rather than allow the bank to fail outright in the open market, an intervention that would have been difficult to explain to a client in 1950 as anything other than the end of the entire system's credibility. The bank that had once stood as one half of the proof that Switzerland could be held accountable for its wartime conduct no longer existed as an independent institution at all, absorbed into the same UBS that Bradley Birkenfeld had once worked for. None of this means the underlying appetite for financial discretion disappeared. It moved. Compliance officers and financial journalists who track where undeclared wealth relocates after a jurisdiction, tightens its rules, point to a familiar pattern. Money that once sat in Geneva now frequently sits in trust structures registered in South Dakota, a state whose trust industry grew from a regional curiosity into an asset base reported at several $100 billion within roughly 2 decades, built specifically around perpetual trusts and disclosure requirements, considerably looser than the international standard Switzerland itself now follows. Other flows have gone to Delaware shell entities, or to newer financial centers in the Gulf that have not yet signed comparable exchange agreements, or to Singapore and Hong Kong private banking desks that quietly picked up much of the client relocation business the Swiss institutions lost after 2009, cities with their own version of discretion and their own list of countries they had not yet agreed to report to. Switzerland spent 84 years selling the world on the idea that discretion was a permanent Swiss export, tied to the mountains and the francs and the neutral flag, a piece of geography treated as though it were a law of nature rather than a choice a parliament had made and could, in theory, have unmade at any point along the way. What the record actually shows is that the discretion was never Swiss by nature, it was Swiss by law, for exactly as long as the law held, and the law held only as long as the cost of enforcing an alternative stayed higher than the cost of walking away. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.